Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us today for the Estate Planning Through a Race Equity Lens, hosted by the Endowment for Equal Justice. My name is Melinda Mann, and I'm the Chief Development Officer of the Endowment for Equal Justice, the largest sustainable fund for legal aid, and its partner organization, the Legal Foundation of Washington, which is the largest private funder of civil legal services for low-income families in the state. As a legal fundraising and grant-making organization dedicated to equal justice, we have known the term leave a legacy of justice for a long time. But those words have taken on new meaning today as our country grapples with a growing awareness of systemic racism and racial injustice. Studies show the largest transfer of wealth will take place in the coming decades, which provides an opportunity to position racial equity and social justice squarely in the path of those funds to help guide them to where they can create a more just world. We're excited to be a catalyst for that conversation. Before we get started, a few Zoom and CLE housekeeping items. By viewing this webinar, you are eligible for 0.5 CLE credit and a 0.5 ethics credit. Please note that if you're joining by phone and wish to receive credit, you must self-report to WISBA through our activity ID number. The activity ID number will be shared in the chat, but it's also listed on our website. For those joining by computer, if you included your Washington State bar number at registration, your credit will be reported within 1 to 2 weeks. A recording of this video will be available upon request, and it will also be posted on our website later this week. We will be reserving all questions until the last 30 minutes. If you have questions for our panelists during that time, please feel free to use the Q&A function. We will also monitor the chat for any questions that you need to bring to our attention. Again, thank you for joining us. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Attorney Teresa Byers, a member of Ogden Murphy Wallace, who specializes in estate planning, tax, and litigation. Teresa also works with tax-exempt and nonprofit organizations. Teresa will be the speaker of the second webinar in this series, taking place in October. We are so glad that she could join us, and now I'll turn it over to her. Again, thanks for joining us for this important conversation.
Thanks, Melinda. It's great to be here. I'm really excited about this topic. I'm hopeful that everyone else here is too, and I appreciate the opportunity to be part of something that I think is brand new and cutting edge. And in that vein, we have a request for all of you. You should see a poll popping up in front of you. It is anonymous. And we're asking for kind of a moment in time view. The moment in time question of how do you feel about this topic, namely estate planning through a race equity lens right now? I'm not going to read through all of your options, but I'll ask you to check the boxes that apply, and I'll give you a little teaser and say this comes into play later. So please do take the time to just click on the poll, click submit, and then close out. We don't want you to miss the opportunity to see our lovely speakers and their PowerPoint by having your poll stuck up. So now I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce our speakers. The lovely Lorraine Del Prado is Principal of Del Prado Philanthropy and Vice President of Thompson & Associates. She specializes in values-based estate planning, consulting, and philanthropic planning. She's a frequent speaker on topics related to philanthropy and purposeful estate plans. She's the president of Leave 10, the past chair of the grant leadership team of the Washington Women's Foundation. She's a member of the Purposeful Planning Institute and the Washington Planned Giving Council, as well as the Estate Planning Council of Seattle. Lorraine is very passionate about the role of philanthropy in estate planning and engaging individual families and organizations in the never-ending quest of improving the world. It's quite the lofty goal. And her co-presenter is Elena Pullman-Venema, who's with us from the Snohomish County Community Foundation. As Director of Gift Planning, she works closely with individuals, families, and their accountants, attorneys, and financial advisors to help build friendly charitable giving options that create meaningful legacies and grow philanthropy. Elena is a co-chair of the Advancing Leadership Committee for the Association of African American Financial Advisors. She is also a former board president for the Snohomish County Estate Planning Council. Welcome to both of you, and thank you so much. Now I'll turn it over to Lorraine and ask that you get us started.
Great, thank you so much. And let me now just share my screen with everyone. There you have it. So thank you again for joining us today for this important conversation on how to incorporate a social and racial justice framework in your estate planning. Now you may ask, what does estate planning have to do with social and racial justice? Well, estate planning is not just about a set of documents. It really expresses your values. It involves personal reflection on your life and legacy. It involves your relationship with your family and society. And it involves how you use your assets to provide for the people that are important to you, as well as the organizations that you care about. And all of these could incorporate the quest for greater social and racial justice. But very importantly, estate planning also enables the transfer of assets inequitably owned from one generation to the next. So it is an unintentional facilitator and perpetuator of the wealth divide among the whites and people of color. So how can you approach your estate plan after recognizing this fact? Now, estate planning is very personal and needs to be tailored to individual situations. Some of you have very young children. Some of you have grown children who are very successful. Some of you have excess wealth, while a lot of you have just enough wealth, and you may lose everything if you need long-term care. So this presentation is not about cookie cutter approaches. It is not about dictating how you should distribute your assets at your death, or asking you to disinherit your children and other heirs in favor of marginalized people of color. We are not asking you to totally abandon your longtime philanthropic passions. And we are not espousing or requiring one way to pursue social and racial justice in your estate plans. At the same time, this webinar is not asking you to perform certain gestures or prove certain optics through one gift or through one hire. So it's not about tokenism. It really is an invitation for you to do the work and to be truly committed and desirous of achieving greater equality. As mentioned in this title, it is an invitation and the start of a conversation. We are inviting you to consider how your wealth accumulation was attainable in part because of white privilege or the inequitable application of opportunities and systems. We are inviting you to also consider how holding, transferring, and inheriting these unequal economic benefits really come with a greater call for responsible stewardship and for engaging in justice-oriented actions. And we are inviting you to consider adding a social and racial justice in your lens in the choice of charities and programs that may be benefiting from your estate plan. And lastly, we're inviting all of you to really engage in conversations with your family, with your peers, with your professional advisors and your charitable beneficiaries about the various ways to promote greater social and racial justice while you are actually managing your wealth and distributing it through your estate plan. Now, you don't have to be rich to do this. The wonderful thing about giving through your estate plan is that you'll be using assets when you no longer need it. And it's at the end of your life. All of us have expenses and pressures right now. We would love to give as much today, and we try to do as much as we could, given that the urgency is there. But through the estate plan, you could actually make a much more significant and meaningful gift. And that's why all of us can participate in this. Too many books have been really focusing on the top 1%, the richest 1%, having the burden of actually addressing racial and social injustice. But all of us can participate in this. And Elena and I do not pretend to be specialists in this topic, far from it. What we're doing is simply synthesizing ideas, concepts, and beliefs that we've learned in our own journey to our fields of values-based estate planning and plan giving. And because the time that we have together is limited, we ask you to just choose some of the ideas that we'll be sharing with you today. If they resonate with you, explore them further on your own or with your family and your friends. And we will actually be making available a handout with a lot of the ideas that we're sharing with you today, which also includes an extensive reading list if you would like to read those books and those articles that inspired some of our ideas today. And before we begin, we think it's important for any conversation on social and racial justice in Seattle to start with really the acknowledgement that we are on land that belongs to the Coast Salish people, and that our city is named in honor of Chief Seattle of both the Duwamish and Suquamish heritage. So what is our agenda today? So we will be defining terms, the social justice, racism, caste, equity. Then we'll take a look at some of the systemic causes and enablers of the racial wealth gap, and also take a look at some current indicators of income and wealth inequality among whites and marginalized people of color. And then we will embark on looking at how social and racial justice framework can be incorporated in estate planning and plan giving, specifically in your pre-estate planning reflections and documents that communicate your values and your vision for your wealth, and you creating your values-based estate distribution plan, and the choice of the causes that you will be including in your plan, and how the assets are managed, either right now or in trusts that are part of your plan, and finally in the engagement of estate planning professionals. We also wish to acknowledge several individuals, social justice activists, charitable individuals, estate and wealth management professionals who read our outline of this talk and gave valuable feedback and suggestions, and also gave us great encouragement and support to pursue what could be a rather controversial topic. We are deeply grateful to all these individuals. So now I will turn it over to Elena, who will give us some understanding of the definition of terms that we'll be using today. Elena?
Great, thanks so much, Lorraine. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. So like Lorraine said, we need to set out some definitions so we're all coming from the same place on certain terms. So there are several definitions of social justice out there, and they have a lot in common actually with one another. We're choosing today to use a definition proposed by Marianne Adams and Leanne Bell's book, Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice. So the goal of social justice is, quote, full and equitable participation of people from all identity groups in a society that is mutually shaped to meet all of their needs. Its vision in a world is a world where the distribution of resources is equitable and ecologically sustainable, and all members are physically and psychologically safe and secure and recognized and treated with respect. This definition broadens what we mean by justice to include being respectful and accountable to everyone, having shared resources, and making sure they're available not only to us, but to succeeding generations as well. Sharing power and agency, and shunning all forms of oppression that cause psychological, economic, and physical harm, including death. So in terms of moving on in the definition of terms, so we want to make sure that we understand the difference between equality and equity, because oftentimes those two words are used interchangeably, and they're not. They're not interchangeable. So when we're talking about social justice, it also brings brings attention to the importance of these two words. So equality and equity. What does equality mean? Well, equality means treating everyone equally, regardless of their individual situations and their individual needs. Whereas equity goes really one step further. Equity provides various levels of support tailored to different people's needs in order to achieve greater fairness and outcomes. So basically, providing every individual with what that individual needs to succeed. So moving on to a definition of racial justice and racism. So the goal of a more equitable opportunities and outcomes is incorporated in the Annie E. Casey Foundation's definition of racism and racial justice. Racism is not simply personal prejudice, and that's really key to understand that difference between personal prejudice and racism. In fact, it's a complex system of racial hierarchies and inequities. It's the belief that one racial group is superior to another, and the fact that that belief is integrated into the systems of a community. And I want everyone to really to remember the word systems, because that's going to be a really key part of our conversation here today. So integrated into the systems of a community, country, or a specific place. Racial justice is a systematic fair treatment of people of all races that result in equitable opportunities and outcomes for everyone. All people are able to achieve their full potential in life, regardless of race, ethnicity, or the community in which they live. So I wanted to tell you a personal story that hopefully will illustrate some points about racism and racial justice. And again, get to the point of the systemic nature, of the institutional nature of racism in the United States, in our country. So I'm biracial. My mom is white, Irish American, and my dad is Black, Zimbabwean, from the Ndebele ethnic group in Zimbabwe. My mom and dad met back in the late 60s in what is now Zimbabwe, what was then apartheid era Rhodesia. They met in 1968 when my mom came to teach at a rural school in southern Rhodesia, where my dad happened to be teaching at the time as well. Well, they got to be friends, and one thing led to another. They became more than friends. However, it was illegal for them to be together. It was illegal for them to marry there or even date. And they actually, a couple of years ago, my mom told me the story about how they actually had a Rhodesian Secret Service police officer assigned to them when they got news out to the local government that my Black dad was dating this white American woman. And this Secret Service guy followed them around and apparently wasn't super stealthy because everybody knew who he was. But anyway, that's another story. So once in the United States, they had to move to the United States to legally marry, being an interracial couple. So once they moved to the United States, or once my dad got to the United States, they moved to New England, where we were the only family of color. So my sister and I, and my mom and dad, we were the only family of color in Western Massachusetts, in our Western Massachusetts town throughout most of our childhood. Some examples, so getting back to the systematic nature of racism. So my little sister, Sarah, 2 years younger than I am, she was placed in her first day of kindergarten, or first week of kindergarten, she was placed in special ed classes in grade school because the kindergarten teacher at the time believed strongly that, well, mixed race kids were troubled and they didn't excel as easily as white children. And as the only mixed race kid in her, as the only kid of color in her kindergarten class, the teacher was making assumptions. Well, the teacher didn't realize that Sarah had two very strong parents who had her back. and we're not going to put her in special ed just because she was a mixed race child. So flash forward 40 years, Sarah actually has her doctorate and is a tenured professor at Emory University. So take that, kindergarten teacher. But I just wanted to tell you that story as an example of some of the systemic racism that I witnessed and that was a part of my growing up. Another just quick example too, and one of my clearest childhood memories is being 8 and it being the week before my birthday. And my cousin Leon, who was visiting from Zimbabwe, he, much darker skinned cousin, came to visit the States for a couple weeks, happened to be the week of my birthday. So Leon and he was 15, I was 8. He took me to the local toy store because he wanted me to pick out a doll for him to buy for me for my birthday present. Well, we took that doll up to the register and the clerk refused to accept the money that he was giving her to pay for the doll because, quote unquote, she couldn't be sure of where he got that money, implying, of course, that he stole it because he was a person of color. Well, he went back and forth with the clerk to the extent of a 15-year-old boy can go back and forth in a respectful, polite way because he was a very respectful, polite guy. And it came down to my white mom having to come down to the toy department and explain in a very firm tone of voice what was going on and that this young man was going to pay for his cousin's doll with money that he had earned himself. So again, getting back to the systemic nature, getting back to of the effect that systemic racism can have on an individual and in a family. So I'm 47, and those two incidents were still really turning points almost in my life, and really is something that really made an impact on me in my childhood. And I know a lot of people of color have experiences similar and even worse than that. So interesting fact, just to wrap up this little story section, is that in 1972, so the year that my parents were married, interracial marriage had only been legal in the United States for 5 years, thanks to the Supreme Court case of, as many of you probably know, Loving versus Virginia in 1967. But on November 2nd, 2000, it's the year 2000, so not too long ago, Alabama became the last state to officially legalize interracial marriage. And in 2000, only 59% of Alabama voters voted to remove language from their constitution that made marriage between a Black person and a white person illegal. So what that means is that in the year 2000, 41% of Alabama voters wanted interracial marriage to remain illegal. And so the reason I'm telling you that is because I think when a lot of us think about racism and racial justice in the United States, we think back to the civil rights movement and we think back to the 1960s and Martin Luther King. And I know that when I was in school, and unfortunately, I know even I have 2 kiddos, one's in 6th grade and one's a junior. And a lot of what they have been learning about the civil rights movement in school has been, well, that's something of the past. That's Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, they solved racism in our country. Well, as we all know, they didn't. And so racism is prevalent in our country right now, because it is ingrained in the systems that make our country our country. And so that's all the more reason why we are really excited that so many folks have signed up and are listening and are participating in this webinar in how to really deal with the repercussions of that. So let's move on to talk a little bit about identities. So identities subject to marginalization. So we've talked about race and ethnicity. So many of you may have heard the term BIPOC, and that is a term of solidarity that really has become used more and more in the past year and a half, I would say. And that the BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. So it's like I said, it's a term of solidarity used to talk about Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So, both social and racial justice focus on those who have been marginalized and oppressed on the basis of their identities. And these include, like we said, race and ethnicity, so BIPOC people identifying, gender identity, social and economic class, religion, disability, and age. And those are just a few of the categories of identities. These identities do not act independently of one another, though. They can exist simultaneously, and we call that intersectionality. And that intersectionality oftentimes compounds inequity. These identities also factor into what we call a caste system, which Isabel Wilkerson's book defines as ranking human value that presumes the supremacy of one group and the inferiority of another. And according to her, in her book Caste, quote, in America, race is the primary tool, visible decoy, and frontman for caste. As such, if you're Black, poor, and disabled, your outcomes are likely to be much worse than when you are white, poor, and disabled, because racism impacts you disproportionately. So now that we've sort of set the stage with some definitions and with some background, let's move forward and talk more specifically about the racial wealth gap. So keeping that in mind, why should you even consider any of the justice-oriented ideas we're proposing today? Well, because there is, as I said before, and as we all know, there is a very unfortunate, undeserved, and very real racial wealth gap in this country, compounding racism. And that racial wealth gap is widening every day. So let's spend a few minutes to substantiate that phenomenon and look at some of the historic and systemic root causes and enablers and current indicators of the racial wealth gap. So we'll specifically look at inequitably applied systems. Again, that word systems of property ownership, economic security, and economic mobility found in just 3 areas for the purpose of our discussion today. So we'll talk about land ownership policies and practices in the United States. We'll talk about the New Deal era legislation, and we'll also talk about the GI Bill. So let's start off talking about land ownership policies and practices in the United States. And we could spend an entire semester or longer, really, talking about policies and practices that put Blacks, Indigenous, and marginalized people of color at a disadvantage in terms of property ownership in our country. But today, we're going to provide 6 examples in our talk today. So the first example has to do with Native Americans. Native Americans suffered from government-sanctioned theft of 1.5 billion, that's billion acres, and forced relocation to approximately 100,000 Native Americans following passage of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. About a quarter of those relocated died in the Trail of Tears from disease and violence. Example number 2 is we're talking about Black former slaves who were promised 40 acres and a mule. Now, getting back to school, so I'm sure most, if not all of you, took U.S. history your junior year in high school. My daughter actually Tandy is taking U.S. history right now at Snohomish High School. And we probably all remember hearing about 40 acres and a mule. So in my education, my junior year, when I learned about post-Civil War and Reconstruction, 40 acres and a mule, I didn't learn a lot of the details about what happened after that and the repercussions. So as a form of reparation, this 40 acres and a mule were provided to former slaves by General William Sherman's Special Field Order number 15 in 1865. These promises were reversed, and this is the part that I didn't learn in U.S. history. I don't know about everybody else, but these promises were reversed by President Andrew Johnson, resulting in only 5% of Black families in the Deep South owning land. So 5% of Black families. African Americans who were able to buy farms in the South represented 14% of Southern farm owners in 1920. This was met with white supremacist backlash. According to Ray Winbush, the director of the Institute of Urban Research, most Black men were lynched between 1890 and 1920 because whites wanted their land. According to a ProPublica article, by the second half of the 20th century, another form of dispossession impacted Black Americans. Since so many Black Americans did not trust the court system, most died without wills, causing unclear titling of land for their heirs. These heirs lost in court battles over legal ownership of that land. And to make matters worse, the FHA and USDA were also known for discriminatory loan practices against Black farmers. And this contributed to a 93% decline in farmers in the United States, from 681,790 in 1940 to 45,594 in 1974. So moving on, in terms of land dispossession, we need to talk about Japanese Americans. Among Japanese Americans, their detention and relocation in internment camps during World War II resulted in uncompensated property loss that could be worth up to 3.4 billion. Again, there's that billion number in the 1980s, according to a study done for the Commission of Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. And lastly, today we're going to talk about redlining. Redlining were the maps and the practice of using maps and identifying neighborhoods where minorities lived as quote unquote high risk or hazardous. These maps were used by most lending institutions and the FHA to deny access to mortgage lending to Black homeowners. The forced segregation and discrimination of redlining officially began in 1934 with the 1934 National Housing Act, which established the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA. Housing covenants adopted by most homeowners associations during the creation of the American suburbs in the 1950s in particular extended this redlining, the effects of this redlining, generation after generation, by forbidding white homeowners to sell homes to Black families. And so again, we're talking about the generational effect of this racial wealth gap. So now Lorraine's going to talk a little bit about the New Deal era legislation as well.
Thanks, Elena. So the New Deal era legislation under President Franklin Roosevelt was designed to help Americans who were made desperate by the Depression. And it's responsible for some of the most important protections that we enjoy today. So you have the Social Security Act, which reduced poverty among the elderly and also provided unemployment insurance. You have the National Labor Relations Act, which guaranteed the right to organize unions and to engage in collective bargaining. And the Fair Labor Standards Act, which created a right to a minimum wage and overtime pay. Unfortunately, two conditions really led to Blacks not benefiting from these two landmark legislations. One, these laws actually excluded agricultural and domestic workers from benefiting from them until later on. And 85% of Blacks and 96% of, so 85% of Black men and 96% of Black women were employed in these sectors, according to sociologist Steven Steinberg. And these laws were also not enforced at the federal level. In order to get this legislation passed, Roosevelt actually allowed the decentralized administration of these benefits. So enabling state, local, and county level officials to really perpetuate some Jim Crow practices and discriminate against Blacks and not allowing them to actually benefit from these legislation. And then lastly, let's talk about the GI Bill, also known as the World War II Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. And this act is widely credited with creating the American middle class. And that's because it enabled millions of veterans to pursue higher education and own homes. But the GI Bill did not benefit Blacks as much due to systemic discriminatory practices. There was pervasive racial discrimination in schools, and the decentralized administration of these education benefits severely limited Blacks' access to higher education. And the historic Black colleges and universities only had the capacity to really accommodate 45% of the returning Black soldiers. And again, as mentioned by Elena, redlining was a big barrier to them. So the discriminatory practices and policies and bank loans and housing covenants and FHA guidelines really practically made Blacks unable to purchase homes. So sadly, the racist policies that were built into the GI Bill's implementation widened the education and income gap between white and Black veterans and significantly enlarged the wealth gap between Blacks and whites multi-generationally. And as if those systemic roots of the racial wealth gap were not enough, we can now also take a look at the US tax system since the 1980s. So since the time of Reagan, taxation has shifted from more progressive taxes on wealth to more regressive taxes on income and consumption, thus unfairly burdening marginalized people of color who rely on wages, while disproportionately benefiting whites and their wealth accumulation. So if you take a look at the decrease of the top marginal rate, that predominantly benefited high income white earners. The lower capital gains tax rate as well, is a low tax rate on wealth accumulation. And that has really exacerbated the wealth gap. Now the 20% of top income earners own 92% of shareholder wealth in this country. And then we have the current estate tax exemption amounts, 11.58 million per person, and 40% tax rate for every dollar above that. And these exemption rates really benefit only the very wealthy in the country. Only less than 1/2% of all dead people will actually pay any estate taxes. And then over the years, you have the anti-tax movement. Over the last 4 decades, especially at the state and municipal level, that has lowered revenue considerably and caused a disinvestment in our infrastructure, including public transit, education, neighborhood revitalization programs, which historically would have benefited marginalized people of color. If you think about Prop 13 in California, which froze property tax rates to 1976, and that has a direct result to the lowering of the quality of public schools in California. So all these systems have a cumulative impact on economic mobility and wealth creation of people of color.
Thanks, Lorraine. So let's keeping that on the history of the creation of the wealth gap and the current situation. Let's take a look at some wealth gap indicators. So all of the systems and more have had long-term consequences on succeeding generations of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or BIPOC, individuals in our country. Here are some dramatic indicators of the racial wealth gap in particular, put together by the Asset Building Network and Prosperity Now group based on 2016 statistics. And so you can see here the wide the disparity between the sum of one's assets, their wealth being the sum of one's assets minus their debts, for 17,000 for Black families versus 171,000 for white families. Pretty significant. And then we look at this graph of all households as well. So also talking about the racial wealth gap in housing and business ownership as well. And one thing that I found very striking and interesting about this graphic in particular is if you look at the percentage of wealth from housing, so the percentage of wealth that comes from housing for different groups, that it's around, it's in between 32% and 39%, but in similar ranges for different ethnic groups. But then you look at the dollar amount that comes from wealth from housing. And for whites, it's 216,000. But for Blacks, it's only 94,000. And Hispanics and other multiple races, for Hispanics, it's 132. And for other multiple races is actually higher, it's the 221. But that disparity between 94,000 and 216,000 is pretty significant. And two, when we look at business ownership, same idea. You look at the percentage of wealth that is encapsulated in business ownership between houses of color and white households, but then you look at the dollar amount that we're talking, quite a huge disparity there. So moving on to education, Lorraine talked about how the GI Bill provided that educational benefit for GIs coming home from World War II, and for the most part, white GIs coming home from World War II. And think about how the legacy of education has manifested itself in your families. Did you go to college? Did your parents, did your grandparents, do or will your kids? And look at the disparities between white adults and adults of color, not only in the higher education attainment of a four-year degree, but the returns on educational investment. And so, white graduates with a bachelor's degree or higher have a median net worth of 4.25 times that of graduates of color. And talking about gap in income, poverty, liquidity, and retirement savings and as well. The average income for a Black American is $39,877 versus $70,118 for white Americans. Households of color are more than 2 times more likely to live below the poverty line. And we look at savings. We look at income savings. We look at retirement savings. In retirement, only 34% of Black families report having retirement accounts versus 60% of whites. Average value, we can see here, $25,000 for Black families versus $77,000 for whites. So getting back to generational wealth, how do these disparities compound generation over generation and layer one on top of another to make it harder and harder for the next generation to break free?
So now that we have hopefully adequately established the systemic causes of the racial wealth gap, and the need for us to all work together toward a greater social and racial justice, let's look at some ways that we can incorporate this framework in our personal estate planning. Now, I encourage all my clients to reflect on their life story, their life lessons, values that they've learned, sources and uses of their wealth, their family relationships, and their desired legacy before they think about their estate distribution plan. So your estate plan and its outcomes really complete the narrative that you've started in your life. So what does your estate plan and the outcomes of your estate plan say about you and what is important to you? So it would be good to look at the sources of your wealth and opportunities, not only in your lifetime, but those of your ancestors. And were those same opportunities available to everyone, regardless of race, the color of the skin, their ethnicity, or the economic class? And you may wish to answer certain questions like, did the color of your skin ever cause you to be treated differently? Like limit the places that you could go, limit the person you can date and marry, like Elena's parents. Make you feel more vulnerable with the police, have very little representation in the books that you read, the movies or TV shows that you watch, or the teachers who taught you. Limit your ability to use a restroom, perhaps in a store, or deprive your ancestors of the right to rule their lives. Now, we need, as your speakers, to also prove to you that we've done these reflections ourselves. So let me share with you some of the results of these reflections in my life. And this will just be a few snapshots. Otherwise, we'll be here for ages talking about my sources of privilege. So I'm Filipino American. I'm an immigrant from the Philippines, which is a developing country. And my father is a government physician and hospital administrator. And my late mother was a university professor. And both of them lived in a province north of Manila and actually had modest wages. I'm an independent contractor, and I've worked most of my time here in the United States for nonprofit organizations. And if you take a look at my retirement savings and my bank account, you will say that I do not have any privilege. But let us unpeel portions of my life and examine what may be sources of my privilege. Well, my father's grandfather, my great-grandfather, Manuel del Prado, came from a tiny village in Asturias, Spain, that actually focused on mining and farming. And he left that tiny village and sought his fortune in the Philippines, which was a colony of Spain at that time. And this was in 1850. And just because he was from Spain, he was catapulted to the very top of the caste system in our country at that time. He measured land for the Spanish crown, and through his marriage and through acquiring land, and I'm also supposing through some royal land grants, which happened to soldiers and administrators at that time, he was able to accumulate a lot of land, income producing land, mostly farming. Well, over time, the land has been subdivided among his 5 children and 30 plus grandchildren, including my father, and was also reduced by agrarian reform. But even 100 plus years later, my father was still able to receive some income from this land. And that income helped provide a safety net for the family. He saved that and invested that income. And it was the result of those savings that he was able to actually pay for my first semester in graduate school in this country. So that is privilege. My father, being a doctor, there was this courtesy that was extended to children of doctors, so that whenever we actually saw another doctor for healthcare, we never had to pay the doctor's bills. We could pay hospital bills, but we wouldn't pay doctor's bills. That's privilege. Now, my mother, as a university professor, she taught English at St. Louis University, and there are so many intangible benefits for having a mother who's an English professor, but there are also tangible benefits in that one of the perks of being a university professor and in that school is that her children will not have to pay tuition in that school. And 4 of my siblings, all my 4 siblings all went to that university and did not pay tuition. So that is privilege. And you might ask, how did my mother actually raise 5 children while also serving as a professor full-time? Well, this is where she depended on a system of household help in the Philippines. And all our lives, we had help, housekeepers who actually helped raise us. So you see a picture here of our Manang Lilia. She was my nanny 55 years ago. And then she left and got married and had children. And she came back to us because it was easier for her to save money with free board and lodging and with the earnings that she would get from us than actually to work in the farm or in the factory. We're very close to Manang Lilia and have helped her. But I can't help but think about how the well-being of our family, our economic mobility, my mom's ability to have a career was actually built on her sacrifices, on the limited economic opportunities that she has. I've been in this country now for 33 years, and during that time, I've had 6 jobs. And I was just thinking back to those 6 jobs and how I got them. And I realized that I competitively applied for only one of them, where there were several applicants. All the rest of the jobs I was able to get because I was highly recommended by a former boss or a former client, or I was recruited by a person that I knew. So that's a system of the network of connections that I benefited from that a lot of marginalized people of color do not benefit from. So I do have a lot of privileges. And that's why I feel very, very strongly that I need to pay it forward, and I need to be part of this movement of really seeking greater social and racial justice in what I do, how I spend my time, and also where I spend my wealth. So in those pre-estate planning reflections that I'm suggesting, you should also think about your children. You know, what privileges did your children have when they were growing up? You know, what will be the future and the opportunities that they will have for their own children? And what values do you want to pass on to them? And what do you consider the highest purposes of your wealth? My husband and I do not have any children, but we have a niece and nephew that we were very close to, and we paid for their education since they were in grade school. And it's been very gratifying to help them because they always applied themselves, never took anything for granted, and were in the dean's list and the honor roll. And so when we were putting together our estate plan, we thought of 70% of our assets going to them at the second death, and then 30% to charitable organizations because they were teenagers at that time. Well, now they're actually in their late 20s. They're very successful in their respective fields, and they found jobs in the fields that they studied. And they are saving money, they are self-reliant, they have their own places where they live, and most importantly, they're very ethical, they're very industrious, they have very close relationships with their family and their cousins. So in all respects, they really represent the ideal outcomes that you would desire for your heirs. So because they're doing well, they actually emboldened me and my husband to reduce what we were reserving for them in our estate and increase the part of our estate that is going to charitable organizations. And you might think, why are you punishing them? You know, when they say no good deed goes unpunished. But we don't think that it's punishing them at all. We think that what we're able to do for marginalized people being served by these organizations is actually a gift from our nieces and nephews to us and a gift of them to society. So we feel very comfortable about that decision. And one thing we would encourage everyone to do when you're creating your estate plan is actually communicate some very meaningful messages about what you stand for. And this could be in legacy letters, ethical wills, whatever your vision statement of your wealth is, maybe a letter of trust intent for any trusts that you're passing on, or even orally. And family meetings. And believe me, these messages will be truly treasured by your heirs and remembered by them. And it will act like a compass for them in times of trouble. It will be a source of inspiration, guidance, and encouragement. And this is where you can include some principles of social and racial justice that you would like to be remembered for. So these are just some of the principles, like belief in intrinsic human dignity, the ability to serve common good, giving priority to the poor and vulnerable, you know, equal access to and participation in economic, political, and cultural life and resources of the community, dignity of work, and the rights of workers. So I think these are important values, and whatever other values you associate with social and racial justice to communicate in these letters. And you might tell me, you know, I already communicate them through my actions, Lorraine. I don't need to write them down. My children know what I'm all about. Well, yes and no. You know, how about your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren? Who would not have the privilege of actually seeing you in action. And these are values that are not taught in public schools. And for heaven's sakes, they're not exhibited by the highest elected officers in this country. So it's really important for you to hand something down that somehow memorializes the ethical foundations of your family. And now in determining your estate distribution plan, you may ask yourself some of these questions. So A lot of my clients always start estate planning by thinking about what to give and how much to give. And I asked them to really change that into thinking about first about why they are giving. You know, what are the ideal purposes served by their bequests to their children? And how much is enough to launch their children into productive, resilient, and purposeful lives? We have those helicoptering parents, right? And apparently there's a worse version of that called the clear the runway parents, because they don't want their kids to struggle at all, when we know that struggle is what actually creates character and problem solving skills. So giving too much money, enabling and making your kids entitled, just like those parents who were involved in that USC enrollment scandal, is the worst thing that you can do. And how can you assure that your heirs really appreciate the Head Start advantage that they have? Like, you know, based on my analysis, I had like 170-year Head Start and have been benefiting, you know, from the unearned privileges and benefits from that Head Start. And are your children prepared to receive and responsibly steward their inheritance? So these are questions that you need to answer when creating your estate distribution plan. Now, one of my clients is a couple that took early retirement in their 50s. They didn't have a lot of money, but you know, it was enough money for them and they knew how to live frugally. And they took early retirement because they wanted to volunteer in nonprofit organizations in the Kent-Auburn area. So they are substitute school teaching, they are teaching in the community college, they are volunteering in the boards of various organizations there. So I worked with them on their estate plan. They have 4 children, 3 of whom are, you know, highly successful engineers in their 30s. And so the couple decided, after really looking at their values, that 50% of their estate was going to the charities that they care about, that serve the marginalized communities, and 50% was going to their children. And they invited me to the family meeting where they were going to reveal this plan to the children. And they asked me, how should we start this meeting? And I told them, well, since you've already started writing your legacy letters, why not read main portions of those legacy letters to your children, so we will ground that meeting in your values. It was such a privilege to be in that meeting. When they read portions of their letters, all of us, you know, was crying because it was just so heartfelt. And it talked about their values, it talked about their faith, it talked about what they consider the highest purpose of their gifts and their capabilities and their wealth. And their children took a look at their estate plan and highly approved it. And in fact, it was funny because they looked at their old estate plan where 100% was going to them and compared it to their new estate plan where 50% was going to them. And they said the new estate plan really is something that they associate with their parents more than the older estate plan. So we encourage you to really be involved in dialogue and to ask your heirs, you know, what they need, because maybe they don't need what you think they need, and be part of this conversation about how to incorporate a greater social and racial justice in the estate distribution plan. And, you know, as I mentioned, you could include charitable organizations in your estate plan if this is something that you think would be suitable in the circumstances of your family. And you could do this in various ways. You could include specific bequests to charitable organizations that are really serving racial justice values. You could dedicate a percentage of your estate or a percentage of the remainder of your estate to charity. Elena and I are board members of this organization called Leave 10, where we're encouraging as many people as possible to aspire to leave at least 10% of their estate to charitable organizations. You know, you could also leave it up to your children to actually disclaim a portion of their inheritance in favor of say, the residue of your estate that it would be dedicated to racial justice causes. So they're feeling as though they're participating in this. Or, you could give your children their inheritance, encouraging them to give a portion to charity, and your children can turn around and make a gift to charity, and for which they can receive an income tax deduction. And then there are various strategies too, where you have the income interest of a trust going to your children, and then the remainder interest going to charity. That's called the charitable remainder trust, or the income interest going to charities and the remainder interest to your family. You can ask your estate planning advisors for this. And then finally, as you're thinking about your estate distribution plan, think about whether you consider yourself the true owner of your assets, or are you just a temporary steward of resources you have accumulated due to your good fortune, but perhaps belongs to the broader community. If the latter, then your plan can then reflect good stewardship of these resources for the benefit of improving the world. Some faith-based organizations echo this notion of stewardship and encourage tithing as an expression of advancing divine love. And then there are also indigenous tribes like the Lakotas that consider material wealth as actually belonging to the community, not private property. And therefore it is intended to care for and to provide a strong foundation for future generations. One charitable individual who I worked with, who passed away last year, dedicated a majority of her estate to funding the vulnerable persons at the bookends of life, vulnerable children and vulnerable low-income seniors. She and her husband were very, very successful in a business that they built in Alaska. So they were very, very close to Alaska Natives, but she was also a very faith-based person. And she told me that, as successful and as prudent as they were, she considers them just lucky. And that is really their responsibility as temporary stewards of these assets to give them back to the community. And that's what she did. And then finally, how do you feel about deploying a portion of your wealth for reparation? If you're willing to think that way, which means helping heal the harm inflicted on marginalized people of color for centuries. And you can do this by maybe dedicating a percentage of what you're giving to charity, or a percentage of whatever you own. And it could go not only to nonprofit organizations, but to non-charitable funds that are focused on wealth building, on economic mobility, mechanisms for people of color, which include education, home ownership, seed money for businesses, mentorship, navigation programs. So this will be part of what Edgar Villanueva called decolonizing wealth. So now let's move on to how to choose charities with a social and racial justice framework, and Elena will lead us in that discussion.
Great, thanks, Lorraine. And so if your focus is going to be on choosing charities with a social and or racial justice framework, there are a few key things that you should keep in mind. Including charities that are focused or have programs that are focused on providing services to communities experiencing disparities and inequities due to race, gender identity, disability, and other historic causes of discrimination is obviously key. Also, another key point is making sure that they truly are accountable to the communities being served. And so a couple of ways to figure that out, that accountability piece, is what's the leadership look like of the organizations? Are they led and guided by people from the communities being served? And are they lifting up voices and grooming future leaders from Black, Indigenous, people of color communities? Give special attention to Black-led organizations. Black-led organizations have historically received less than 2% of foundation grants, and yet they're on the front lines of social change. So that's a key group to really look long and hard at. Strive to address the root causes of economic, racial, and social injustice and have the ground expertise on these issues. And lastly, endeavor to align the investment of their charitable dollars. So the organizations that you're looking at are truly in it for the long term. And so they're endeavoring to align the investment of their charitable dollars with their mission that directly addresses inequality. So providing charitable contributions, what are some of the key things that you need to keep in mind if you decide that you want to do this? So key in that area is making sure that you're providing charitable contributions that are flexible and unrestricted. Provide support immediately over a 3 to 5 year period, as opposed to a trickle that oftentimes happens with endowment gifts. For supporting Black-led social change infrastructure, such as leadership development, community organizing, and the building of Black economic power. So again, they're in it for the long term. This isn't just a flash in the pan. These criteria are taken from the Washington Women's Foundation and the group Resource Generation. So there are many examples of charities that are focused on the long-term social change infrastructure issue, that nationally and locally. So nationally, big ones like the NAACP, Black Lives Matter, HBCUs, so historically Black colleges and universities, but also locally, there are a lot of good groups doing some fantastic, impactful things in our local communities. Up here in Snohomish County, we have the wonderful group Project Girl that's empowering young women and helping them succeed, for the long term. We have Communities of Color Coalition, also the Black Future Co-op Fund. The organization that I work for, the Community Foundation of Snohomish County, we're working actually closely with the Black Futures Co-op Fund at this point. We've actually just started working with them, but we're very excited about building that relationship. And one of the things that we're hoping to do is create a list of Black-led nonprofits and charities that are focused on communities of color, specifically in Snohomish County. So your local community foundation is also a place to go for advice if you're looking for specific organizations that are supporting these causes. As one of my colleagues at the Black Futures Co-op Fund reminded me a few weeks ago in one of our brainstorming calls, she said, when it comes to philanthropy, when it comes to charitable giving, be a good ancestor. And that resonates so much with me, that think of this in the long term. That, as I said before, we need to be supporting communities of color. We need to be supporting disenfranchised local communities and national communities in our country for the long term, and so that we're going to be making sustainable change.
Elena, the Endowment for Equal Justice has also been supporting some great organizations.
True. Yep. Yeah. And in terms of the, specifically for the Columbia Legal Services and Northwest Immigration Rights Project as well, that they're doing amazing things locally. So, they're, whether it's looking to our friends at the Endowment for Equal Justice, calling up your local community foundation, or other sources in the community that start doing the research. There are a lot of good things happening, both locally and nationally. So, moving ahead, also consider donating to organizations involved in changing the system through legislative and political action. As Lorraine said before, that this kind of giving through your estate or giving while you're still with us is not just for the 1%. It's not just for the folks who have substantial financial means. That while contributions to non-501c3 charities won't necessarily get you a tax deduction, since most estates will not be subject to estate taxes, it might not be that big of an issue with many folks. Also, be proximate. And like we were talking about before, really know the organizations that you're supporting. Go to the communities, meet with the leaders, discuss what truly are the needs on the ground. And don't ignore the small, scrappy organizations led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are leaders, which are fiscally sponsored, but are not necessarily but are also doing the effective community-based efforts to address these inequities. Their systemic inclusion from traditional social, economic, and political resources have a lot to do with why many Black-led organizations are not independent 501c3 organizations, but they're still doing important work. And lastly, be humble. Be humble, but share your story as a donor. Share it with your peers, because your peers may also want to be doing this important work, supporting these important charities and nonprofits in our community, but they may not know where to start. And so they may need you to help them start. So share your story. So one last piece, my dad, who, as I mentioned before, is is Indebele from Zimbabwe. He has used this expression that he's used for as long as I can remember. And he uses it with the students he used to teach as a former principal, with the teachers he used to mentor, with the many boards he's currently on in his quote unquote retirement, even though he's busier now than when he was actually working, right down to the girls soccer team that the two of us coached together for 12 years. And that Indebele expression is umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu. And what that means is, I am a person because you are a person. And truly, that's really what it's all about. That, in my humble opinion, that raising people up, supporting the goal of racial and social equity and racial and social justice for ourselves and for other people really makes us all more of a person. And that's how we're going to succeed as a country and as a community. As for some future, for other resources, talk about, local social justice fund, the community foundations, the Endowment for Equal Justice, lots of resources. Do your research and ask for help if you want more information.
Great. Thanks, Elena. So, and if you want to align your estate plan and wealth management with your values, then your investments and your assets and trusts will also need to reflect your social justice values. Now, Elena and I are not investment professionals, but we asked our friends at the Fulcrum Capital of Seattle, that's known for values-based investing, to give us some suggestions here. Now, according to them, this is a relatively new area, investing with a social justice lens, and there are a lot of challenges that are associated with inconsistent definitions and metrics, poor quality data, inadequate measuring tools, and incomplete disclosures. But it's also a time for opportunities, because investors can demand more portfolios to actually be managed and constructed with these values. So we will have better access to these types of investments in the future. But in the meantime, work with your advisors to look at the policies and practices in the investment of your assets. So you can divest investments in businesses that negatively impact marginalized communities, like private prisons, predatory lending, guns, pipelines in indigenous lands, and immigrant detention. Don't only look at the stocks that you own or the bonds that you own. Also take a look at the real estate investment trusts. So GEO, the company that's actually responsible for the private prisons, is not a publicly held stock. It's actually a real estate investment trust. Invest in funds, companies, and programs that drive positive social outcomes. So this could be institutional funds that have that environment, sustainability, and governance lens, such as Calvert, Domini, and Parnassus. Or you could ask your advisors to do some deep analysis by actually just calling the companies and asking them, some really very penetrating questions about their practices. And then the use of some screening tools, such as Sustainalytics, MSCI, Equilo, and Equili. And then engage in advocacy through proxy voting and shareholder activism to really demand, more diverse boards, at least 33% of women and people of color. I'd say at least 50% women and people of color. Make sure that they have pay practices that reduce inequality and that they exhibit equitable hiring and promotion practices, living wages, access to healthcare, and family-friendly policies. Now, diversity actually contributes to better run companies that have better results, whether it's in performance and profitability and less risk-taking and lower cost of capital. In fact, a 2018 McKinsey study said that companies with more culturally and ethnically diverse executive teams were 33% more likely to see better than average profits. And then companies with board of directors that also were more ethnically diverse were 43% more likely to see above average profits. So demand that from your professional advisors who are managing your assets.
Exactly. Thank you, Lorraine. And, and let's not forget applying that social and racial justice framework to the engagement of these estate planning professionals, many of whom are with us here today. So there actually are many firms and industry associations that can really help clients and help donors in this search, and also help other advisors to connect with each other. One organization that I'm a huge fan of is the Association of African American Financial Advisors. I've been involved with what we call Quad A for about 3 years now. I'm co-chair of their Advancing Leadership Committee. And one of the really neat things that they've put on their website is you're able to go into, I think it's one of the first pages of their website, and search for a financial advisor who's a person of color in your specific region. So it's a nationwide organization. So you just go in, you type in Seattle, and you can find who are the members of the association that are in that area. So that's a great way if you're looking for financial advisors. Also, the National Association of Black Accountants has a very strong Seattle chapter, so I recommend reaching out there. Likewise, the National Conference of Black Lawyers, National Black Lawyers, also is a very strong industry organization. Some national firms, actually, too, they have stated and, most importantly, demonstrated their commitment to advancing diversity and racial equity in particular. Some ones that pop out: LPL Financial, U.S. Bank, Raymond James. A number of them have what I've noticed are Black Advisor Network groups within their organization. Also, Women Advisor groups. So that's that one thing that stands out to me when I'm looking for advisors to partner with in terms of my community foundation work, is that those type of commitments really tells me that these organizations, again, are in it for the long term in terms of supporting that diversity, supporting that racial and social equity. That work. So just continue to look, and when the firms that you're looking for, what is their true commitment to equity and diversity.
Great. So as I mentioned in the beginning of this webinar, we'll be sending all of you some handouts that enumerate the many ways that you can incorporate racial and social justice in your estate planning, charitable giving, and investments. And these handouts also include some recommended reading. So we hope you found this webinar useful in starting an important conversation. This is a journey. It's a difficult journey and can never be accomplished quickly and perfectly. We encourage you to take small steps, but start with your own self-reflection. Choose to implement the parts that resonate most with you now. And please consult like-minded friends and exchange ideas on how you wish to implement or tailor these and other ideas in your own estate plans. We also encourage you to write a personal statement about your own beliefs and values regarding social and racial justice and how you wish these to be reflected in your estate plan and plan giving. And finally, please discuss this topic and the actions you plan to take with your family. And with that, we'd like to thank you for patiently listening to us today. And we'd like to now ask Teresa to come back and moderate the Q&A. Teresa?
Hi, everybody. So this is a moment for you to take and look down at the bottom of your screen. There's a Q&A section there. So please take the time to type those in and we'll try and work our way through them. Thank you so much to our amazing speakers for bringing in and educating us on a very difficult topic. And difficult for a number of different reasons, but one of them I thought that was interesting that came up early on in this process that was asked within the community is the question of how do we actually have these conversations? How do we engage in this discussion, both from the perspective of people who may still be coming to awareness of this issue, as well as from the perspective of how do we bring it up with people who have a history of distrust with some of the inherent institutions around estate planning? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on both sides of that spectrum.
Great. So here's what I would suggest. For the easiest way to do this is to start these conversations first with individuals and family members, clients, and friends who have already demonstrated passion and interest for social and racial justice. So that's the safe way to go. The other way to do it is to employ oblique communication. So rather than talking about the person directly in front of us and about their actions and about their plans, talk about somebody else or talk about a story that you've heard. Hey, I've heard that you could actually do this. You know, I heard so and so did this. What do you think about that? Somehow oblique communication always works, especially when you're talking about death, right? Because nobody wants to face thoughts about their mortality, and that makes it safer. You know, I think oblique communication is also when you're talking to your teenager about very delicate matters, and you talk to them while you're driving the car, right? You're not actually looking at them directly. So that's one of my suggestions. Elena, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think it's important to meet people where they're at. You know, unfortunately, sometimes you might not know where they're at because they don't know how to bring up that piece of the conversation. And so, you know, in this day and age, with everything that's going on in current events, you know, depending on your comfort level, talking about current events, stories in the news, bring that up and just to kind of test the waters, as they say, that they may be wanting to talk with someone, but not knowing what words to use or how to start that conversation. I think Lorraine's point about talking about values, about talking about what kind of legacy do you want to leave in your community, or what's important to you in the community. I mean, I think one thing as a parent right now that, you know, my husband and I are in a place where we don't have a lot of liquid assets that we can be donating to charity. We have made a plan in our estate plan to create a donor advised fund that our kids will advise. But again, getting back to being a parent, one of the things that is top of my mind is education. Both of my kiddos are in online school right now. And, you know, even with all of the privilege that we have as a family in terms of online access, screens access, we're still having issues of keeping everybody online. And that we've seen over and over again in the news, especially in our local communities, that the effects of the coronavirus, whether it's health effects, whether it's education effects, whether it's access to education and access to healthcare, that has hit communities of color disproportionately. And so that's just another way of bringing up the conversation of, well, what do you think about this? Hey, have you ever thought, there are ways for you to support education in marginalized communities. Did you know that? Hey, here are some great groups. Those are some thoughts that I have.
And to add to what you were just saying, Elena, I think that COVID has really forced us to think about our privilege, our blessings, and to really be very empathetic about how so many people are hurting out there. So I think it has really emboldened us to be part of braver conversations about these issues. So ask permission among your friends and family. Can I talk about this because this is something that I'm feeling right now and I want to do something about it. But don't avoid it. Don't assume that they're not also willing to engage in these conversations, because maybe they're really thinking about it and they're asking you to introduce the topic to them.
Yeah, I think one conversation that I had with an estate planning attorney who unfortunately couldn't attend today, but is looking forward to looking at the recording and hopefully attending another webinar on the topic down the road. She was saying that just how important it is that she's been struggling as an attorney to find the words to talk about this stuff and to talk about, the bigger picture of values and what kind of impact you want to leave in your community with her clients. But even just to be able to start the conversation with, hey, I saw this, wow, this, the access to education is, I read this article about how it's just really impacting communities of color so much more than it's impacting a lot of other white communities and more well-off communities. What do you think about that? I mean, I think asking the open-ended questions, like, what do you think about that? Or did you see this article? Did you see, this thing that's, that I saw, whether it's Facebook or whatever, but just kind of bringing up current events and asking open-ended questions, and you'll get to know pretty quickly if they want to explore it more.
So I'm going to take a quick little pause here and ask everyone to take a minute, and you're going to see that poll that we did earlier pop back up. And we're temperature testing here. So asking the same question and putting that immediacy on it, what words describe how you feel about estate planning through a social and racial justice lens right now? And I think it'll be an interesting thing for all of us to see how this has changed, and if it's changed in the last hour and a half that we spent together. And I know something that people have been asking throughout the presentation and even before the presentation, and it was previewed really nicely and discussed really nicely during this, is that we need some help with language and definitions and how we use words. So as we're trying to be advisors and we're trying to be better parts of our community, what are some of the resources that we should consider looking to? What are some of the things we should be reading? Who should we be talking to? What should we be watching to be better informed participants in this conversation?
I think one of the things that we're going to be providing, if we haven't already provided it to folks, Teresa, is a reading list and part of the handouts. That
Right.
There are some fantastic books out there that really will help in terms of the education, not only in terms of language, but in terms of the history of our country. I know, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, in terms of the education that so many of us got and didn't get in the traditional school system, that there's a lot of history that we still really need to truly understand in this country. And so reading, there are some great documentaries, podcasts out there, and ask other people, friend me on LinkedIn and let's chat. Like there are so many resources out there. But yeah, I would say, so you could start with that list that we have in those handouts.
Yeah. And, this is a work in progress. We welcome your suggestions on improvements and other materials that we should include in it, because we'll be presenting to other audiences. So please feel free to contact us directly and give us your thoughts and your suggestions.
And I think there have been a few reminders and discussions that have already started happening. So congratulations to everyone who's figured out how to use the chat feature and is doing so. I know we've had a couple of people ask about the availability of the materials, and so I'll just remind everyone they will be available afterwards. And it sounds like both of our presenters are excited about being ongoing resources. So I think there'll be ways to reach out to them as well that are apparent. One of the questions that came up, looks like we've got Melinda there too, and I don't want to go over my time, but I am going to just real quickly ask the question. Are there things that you feel that the professional advisors and the people on this call that are invested in this can be doing in real time today to make people more comfortable in their environment? Are there little things that we should be aware of that make these conversations easier to have, that make them more accessible? When someone comes into our office, or when someone signs into a Zoom call, or when someone picks up the phone, what can we do to make our entire environment more welcoming to this?
Well, I think authentically and sincerely being hospitable, open, warm, humble, looking at yourself as being part of this community. I think, when you start with that vantage point and that informs everything that you do and how you approach people. I you know, I come from a culture that is very, very welcoming, sometimes too welcoming. When I came to this country, I first went to Boston. Boston is just, as Elena probably would attest to, as the most reserved people. Oh my God, did I suffer? And they didn't know that they're reserved, and Seattleites are also notoriously reserved. That the reserve is actually basically kind of putting a line. Here I am behind this line, and here you are behind that line. And if we can take that line out and just really connect to each other more directly and more sincerely, I think it starts with that. But there are other practical things, I'm sure, Elena, that you can suggest from your vantage.
Well, no, I think that's fantastic. And I would say, just listen. Mm-hmm. Check in. This is a hard time for everybody that we're going to, and some people are having a harder time than others. And when it comes down to it, we don't really know who's going through what, and in my experience. And so my top recommendation is, whether you're talking to a client, whether you're talking to a family member, whether you're talking to a colleague, is just listen and check in with them and say, how you doing? What happened this week that, made you feel great, that made you maybe not feel so great? And just be there for them. I think that for me personally and professionally, I'm trying to really do that more. So for me to talk less, which is really hard for me sometimes, but just to be there as an ear and a shoulder, oftentimes is the best thing, I think.
Yeah, if I may, Isabel Wilkerson, who wrote the beautiful book Caste and then The Warmth of Other Suns, had this a wonderful concept that she introduced called radical empathy. So sympathy is looking across at someone and feeling sorrow, right? And empathy is trying to walk in their shoes. But radical empathy means putting in the work to educate oneself and to listen with a humble heart, to understand another's experience from their perspective and not as we imagine we would feel. Radical empathy is not about you and what you think you would do in a situation you have never been in and perhaps never will. It is the kindred connection from a place of deep knowing that opens your spirit to the pain of another as they perceive it. Please read this book, Caste. It's just a beautiful book and filled with all those pearls of wisdom.
And I think one last thing too is, it's okay not to know the answer. Yeah. That I think, the true. And I mean, and for all of us, that we're all climbing that learning curve, and some of us are climbing it faster than others, and some of us are starting off at different points in that learning curve. But I think it's okay to say, if someone's asking you questions, especially about topics of racism and racial justice, for your answer to be, that's a great question, and I don't know how I feel about that. I don't know the answer to that. But I'm gonna look into it. I think to be open to broadening your own horizons, but also to admit that you don't know everything, and that's okay, is really important.
That's great. I want to just say thank you to Lorraine and Elena and Teresa for joining us today for this important conversation. We appreciate all of you. And I also wanted to thank you, Lorraine, for sharing that concept from Isabel Wilkerson. And we'll put something in the chat. We over at the Foundation have started just a very preliminary resource page for racial justice resources, including videos and movies and podcasts and books and articles. And we invite you to peruse that as you think about having more of these conversations and learning more. And Teresa, do you want to say just a few words about the upcoming webinar in October? And we hope you'll join us for the second in our series.
So this is a blatant pitch, but hopefully a chance to continue this conversation a little bit. On October 20th, I'll be talking about estate planning, really 101, but maybe taking it back to a lens that involves some of the things that we discussed today. So who's really involved and what are we really doing with an estate plan? What happens with the different types of assets we have and how can we be intelligent about planning with them? And in case anyone forgot, in the realm of all that has happened in 2020, back in January, the Secure Act passed. And now that it's getting to be the end of the year, we should probably have some conversations about that. So I'll invite any of you who are interested in those topics to join us again.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody.